no use sit and wonder why, babe. Even you don't know by now.
It is a pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight and this afternoon in other time zones for what promises to be a wonderful evening of discussion and appreciation. I want to begin by introducing myself. I am Ilana Blumberg and I direct the Shane D. Rudolph Graduate Program in Creative Writing. I want to thank certain guests who are with us tonight, Gabi Danon, our chair, all of our faculty in literature and our close colleagues in linguistics, faculty who founded our program, Linda Zisquit and Alan Hoffman, our benefactor, Hedda Rudolph, also the mother of Shendi Zichrona Livracha, and all the other members of her family, and so many alumni and current students who are eager to meet together and to celebrate Professor Michael Kramer on the eve of his retirement. A word about the order of events. Originally, I thought we would begin with the conversation on Israel 2020, but then Michael reminded me that his grandchildren might not last out that full conversation, and so in their honor, we will allow their Saba to speak first rather than last. To me, this is not merely a quirk. This is entirely emblematic of Michael. Many tonight will talk about Michael as a wonderful teacher, colleague, mentor, and scholar. I want to open simply by saying that in addition to teaching Israel's first literature seminar devoted solely to Bob Dylan, to piloting our Jewish art seminar, to translating Agnon, to enriching the field of Jewish American literature, to reading piles of contemporary fiction in order to identify some of its most promising practitioners, Michael is first and foremost a person of family and community. He nurtures younger faculty members and gives them support when they are facing the hurdles of teaching challenges, bureaucracy, and daunting new scholarly projects. For those of the faculty like myself who came to Israel as new Olim, Michael has been far more than a colleague. He has understood and laughed and encouraged and projected faith and hope that everything would work out. The secret of the Israeli phrase, Yeh Tov, it'll all be okay, is that it depends who says it. It depends how much effort they are willing to make to ensure that it comes true for others. Michael is a remarkable force, both on scene and behind the scenes. His generosity and his sense of being firmly linked to others, his sense of humor and irony, and his simultaneous ability to appreciate the good has shaped the ethos of our department. It's my pleasure to invite him to speak.
If that's more peculiar, or the idea that there's anything honorable about being retired, about no longer doing what I've done for nearly a half century, or the notion that after all those decades of frontal teaching and lecturing, of interacting with a flesh and blood audience, my swan song is a Zoom song, but we live in peculiar times. Be that as it may. I want to thank all of you who have Zoomed in this evening or afternoon. Those of you who are here for the main event, the conversation among three extraordinary thinkers and writers whom I greatly admire, Yossi Klein Halevi, Lana Blumberg, and Mati Friedman. I know you won't be disappointed, but also I wrote here the handful of you who are here as a kindness to me, to bid me farewell. I've prepared some brief remarks, and I hope they'll indeed be brief. Some of you who've attended earlier literary events of the Shane D. Rudolph Graduate Program in Creative Writing know me primarily as the old guy who gives the introductory Dvar Torah, and I'm sticking to that genre. But tonight, this afternoon, it will be a valedictory Dvar Torah as well. Since we are between Pesach and Shavuot, I've chosen to consider a text from Pirkei Avot, specifically the first Mishnah of the fourth chapter, Shimon ben Zoma's well-known series of counterintuitive overturnings, redefinitions of what it means to be wise, to be heroic, to be wealthy, all drawn from the prophet Jeremiah's castigation, chapter 9, verse 22, of those who vaingloriously take pride in and claim a certain social status and aristocratic privilege by virtue of the knowledge they've garnered, the battles they've fought and won, the riches they've accumulated. Ezo Chacham, right, and so forth. But I want to focus here on the fourth of this series, one not drawn from the prophet's admonition, but one that Ben Zoma apparently inserted on his own initiative. one that reflects back on the three that preceded it, and one particularly apt for this evening. Ezehu mechubad hamechabed et habriot. Who is truly honored? The one who honors others. When my colleagues first approached me about their hosting a literary event in my honor, or in honor of my retirement, I hesitated. For complicated reasons that I myself don't wholly understand, it made me uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. I'm still uncomfortable. But then I thought of Ben Zoma's dictum. If they are honoring me, I reasoned, then it's they themselves who are truly being honored, not me. Thank you, Ben Zoma. My wife just corrected, not I. Thank you, Ben Zoma. This eased my comfort considerably, but not completely. I was unwilling to rely on my own intuition about Ben Zoma's counterintuition. I wanted support. So I delved into the literary tradition. Those of you who've taken the Jewish Arts Seminar know that's my thing. Scouring the many commentaries that have puzzled over Ben Zoma's apothegms for millennia, till I found what I had hoped for. What struck me was the way some of the commentators, the Maharal of Prague, of Golem thing, Reb Chaim of Volozhin, for something completely different, others as well, they zoomed in on the word briot, the word I translated simply as others. But briot, of course, doesn't mean others. It doesn't even mean all people. Izeo Chacham, Ben Zoma says, Haled mi kol adam, who is wise, the one who learns from all people. But that's not what he says here. Here he uses the word briot. And briot literally means creatures, God's creatures, deserving of respect, of honor, whether or not they are wise or heroic or wealthy, even if they are only average, even if their accomplishments are at best modest, still deserving of honor simply by virtue of their being God's creatures, of being created in God's image. To recognize value in this, to honor someone for something so basic, so unremarkable, says more about the honorer than the honoree. I like that. I could live with that. Thank you, Ben Zoma. Thank you, Maharal. Thank you, Reb Chaim. Creatureliness was definitely within the comfort zone of this scraggly boy from Brooklyn. This boy who was never quite sloughed off his working class origins. Ask my long-suffering wife, who is right here. This boy who's been blessed not only with terrific kids and grandkids, whom he hopes to hug again one of these days, very soon, but also with a career that allowed him to know some really, really smart and creative people. Scholars and writers, novelists and poets and memoirists and essayists, truly accomplished people, people whom he was privileged to call his friends and colleagues. This creaturely boy from Brooklyn, who knows that if he is being honored today, it is largely to them that the honor accrues. The list is long, but don't worry, I'm not going to talk about my first grade teacher and my second grade teacher. But I'd like to single out very, very briefly three of those to whom I am indebted. Individuals who are no longer with us, but without whom I would literally not be here. The first, my teacher, Sakvan Berkovich, Zichrono Livracha, easily the most brilliant scholar I have ever known, who taught me how to think and how to write and so much more, who when I was a fledgling scholar generously finagled for me an invitation to an international conference in Budapest, where he introduced me to the second in this line, the dazzling Emily Budick, Zichrona Livracha, who urged me and then kindly sponsored my application for a Fulbright Fellowship to the Hebrew University and ushered me into my life in Israel. And third, it was Emily who introduced me to the indomitable Shendi, Zichrona Livracha, the founder and sine qua non of our creative writing program. whose vision and energy, simply put, changed my life. And if not for whom, none of us would be here at this event. I don't want to impose on your patience any longer. Thanks to Yessi and Mati for agreeing to do this. Thanks to Ilana for all her hard work when she had so much else to do. Thanks to all my colleagues for insisting. L'chaim to them. Let's see, where was I? Thanks to Hedda and Sarah and Simone, to Shandi Zichrono Livracha, to Shelley Zichrono Livracha, to Jane, my one and only, to my students from whom I've learned so much, to all who zoomed in, thank you. I am humbled by your kindness and regard. And to those of you who didn't zoom in, don't think twice, it's all right. Back to you, Ilana.
Thank you, Michael. It was a good choice to start the evening with you.
Right.
Okay. We're going to turn now to Professor Bill Kolbrener, who's going to speak on behalf of our department.
I feel so lucky and privileged that I get to speak tonight, because I'm sure there are 200 other people here at least who would love to be in my shoes where we get to talk about Michael on this day. I met Michael, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And one of the things that I remarked from the very beginning of our relationship was that Michael was,
was almost 25 years ago.
Oh my goodness. Okay, that makes me almost as old as you. So one of the things that I remarked upon at first, that was Michael was always going to a funeral. He was always going to a shiva call. He was always saying Kaddish for a friend or a former teacher. I don't mean to be a downer here, but I'll continue. My colleagues and I were going to put together a compendium of Michael's out-of-office messages. Do you ever remember getting any of them? I think we may still come through on them. Yeah. I'm going to read you one of them. I think this might be the most literary and the most poetic. I inch slowly closer to the edge, closer, careful, not to lose my footing on the loose gravel. I usually say I'm afraid of heights, but it's the depths that truly terrify me. I pause. I'm not quite there, but I begin to see the chaotic vastness beyond first whips of gray clouds. Here and there, a flickery flicker of light, a firefly flicker of light, but mostly a deepening darkness and the vague outlines of a valley below. I shudder. I turn back. Not yet, I tell myself. Not yet. I think in Michael's amazing honesty about the existential truth of the way we live, to me, it proves what Ilana was saying before. It depends who says it. When Michael says Yeh Beseder, it's an affirmation of life. It's an affirmation of life with all of the knowledge of this. Michael's work has focused on three figures, or Michael's life has focused on three figures, two of them who I love almost as much as he does. Philip Roth, Agnon, and Dylan. And all three of those, in their own way, talk about death, or exile, or angst. Michael and I were just talking about the new Dylan song, Murder Most Foul. Dylan also giving that sense. I always have the sense with Dylan that he is the artist that you look at and think of Yesh Me'ayin. There was nothing, and suddenly something is there. A creativity as a protest against the darkness. I got really Michael to write this speech for me. We were talking about Roth and Agnon and Dylan in our correspondence. This is what he writes about Roth. But modern Jewish literature is fundamentally focused on Jewish life rather than Jewish texts. And the master here is Roth. The trauma, the anxiety, the grittiness, the mundane reality. Not that Roth isn't immensely literate, even Jewishly literate, but for him, the Jewish literary tradition begins with Kafka. Even in his most experimental phase, his focus is always on Jewish life as it is lived from its intellectual and emotional heights to its scatological lows. Dylan, on the other hand, is in some ways very much like Agnon, and in that he understands how to create through and within tradition. For both, literary language is fundamentally intertextual, rooted, redolent with the meanings that preceded them. We may not always hear it, but the layers are always there working their magic. That's Michael. Certainly the Kafkaesque grit. How are you, Michael? Could be worse. In the context of Michael's out of office message, yeah, could be a lot worse. But also, and this is what's so special to me about Michael, when you're with Michael, you feel you are really like with Agnon or with Roth. You don't feel like you're with a person, you feel like you're with this compendium of Jewish and literary sources. Those of you who took his Jewish life seminar know this. You hear, just as he says of Roth, the layers are there, working together. And with Michael, as I felt for so many years now, you feel the magic. L'chaim, Michael, we love you.
Thank you, Bill. We're going to turn to a former student of Michael's, Dalia Fadila, Dr. Dalia Fadila. Are you here, Dalia?
Yes, I'm here. Hi,
Wonderful.
everyone.
Okay.
Hi, Professor. How are you?
Dalia earned her PhD at Bar Ilan and is the founder of a school system, and we're so lucky that she'll be coming to teach for us this coming year.
Actually, I'm very grateful to have
The appropriate link. Okay.
Excellent.
All right, Dalia, please.
So it's funny to resume after that Kafka part of.
Bill, you're going to have to do the recording, Bill, because you're next.
We're recording now, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I'm actually very grateful and to be honoring Professor Michael Kramer, my professor. I always call you Professor Michael, my professor. And Professor Michael Kramer is not just a lecturer or a mentor, he's a lifelong mentor. And he's one that stays with you even after you already graduate and you rarely see him, but he's a mentor who stays with you all life along. And this is the case with me, actually, despite the fact that after my graduation, I rarely met Professor Kramer, but Professor Kramer was totally in my mind. I thought all the time, what would Professor say? How would he react to this? How would he criticize? What kind of a joke? What ceiling is he looking at right now to figure out what to say next and what question to ask? When I joined Bar Ilan University, I already joined it in the early 90s, 1991, it was the Gulf War. And when I decided to come back for my PhD studies, it was already after September 11th. So is that Kafkaic or something else? And it was at that seminar with the Professor Michael that when other people at that time saw in September 11th as Islamophobia, as profiling Arabs as terrorists, and he saw an opportunity to try to prove that actually literature written by Arabs in America, whatever it is, if there is such thing since the late 19th century, is actually a genre. And like Professor Kramer, he likes to widen horizons. So he asked me to study Jewish American literature, African American literature, Asian American literature, and all the kind of hyphenated literatures out there to try to figure out whether the literature written in English by Arabs in America for 3 or 4 or 5 generations is a genre. To be honest, the 5 years I spent studying that genre or creating or trying to prove that it's a genre with Professor Michael, it was more of a self-interested journey of search for identity and for roots and for definition and for hyphenation and for questions like Israeli Arab, Arab Israeli, Muslim. And I remember the first time I wrote an enthusiastic chapter in my PhD around the Crescent, the Iraqi-American protagonist of the book, Sirin, who lives in America with an Iraqi father. And it was like almost 50 pages of very enthusiastic kind of literary analysis. And I brought that to Professor Michael and he said, this is not literary criticism. And I asked why, and he said, because you fell in love with Sirin. Remember? Professor Kramer, you said it's falling in love with the character, and this is not criticism. And this is from that point, I started learning how to be critical, how to analyze, how to go beyond the limits of falling in love with literature and actually criticizing it. I remember the last day in our 5-year journey into proving the genre of Arab American literature, and you said, give me another year. That meant a 6th year, and it would be perfect. And I said, we should ask my husband about that. To a child in the middle of that PhD and having 2 already younger kids at home. So I said, it's perfect enough for me. And that standard, that kind of pushing the limits, going beyond your mind, going beyond even the love that you have for what you do, and criticizing even the good things in yourselves is something that stayed with me. Professor Kramer actually taught me how to write English. I was a brilliant student. I thought I knew how to write English, but each time I wrote something, he showed me how my Arabic mind comes into my English language. And then he taught me the power of simple sentences in trying to express smart ideas and the simplicity in understanding complexity. And by the way, that was one of the secrets of Professor Michael, is that the way I have learned how to write simple sentences, I had to go and read all your articles and try to imitate them, like copy them, and then figure out what is it in your simple, sophisticated style that brings that smartness in an idea despite the simple grammar. And actually that led me to another embracement of complexity, my own complexity. And that's the reason I decided to follow up a career of starting education in the Arab community in Israel. As I said earlier, Professor Kramer is a mentor that stays with you your life long, and the way he thinks, his spirit, the way he asks questions is, I find myself sometimes in a way being the mentor to others that I have learned to be with you as your student, Professor Kramer. The question of how did you do that? What is it that you do to make people like follow you in that sense? I have no idea, but I have one clear idea. Professor Kramer is unique. With my so many Jewish friends, very close friends, he's one of the very few who remembers when Ramadan starts, when Ramadan ends, when Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Adha, very specific on the dates, despite the fact that all Islamic sheikhs around the Arab world hesitate around that. You figure it right, you should be our sheikh, Professor Kramer. And he always sends that greeting in Arabic and in English, and it's amazing. It shows what kind of a person is that. It's studying with you, my professor, is really understanding culture and identity and life and humanity and spirit and the power of education in finding your true mentor who stays with you, and that's what is it. This is why Bar Ilan, I spent 15 years at Bar Ilan, my bachelor, my master, my Teudat Hura'ah, my PhD, and I keep defining myself as a Bar Ilan graduate, and Professor Kramer, you're the reason why I do that.
Thank you very, very much, Dalia.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to ask Joseph Skybell if he's on, if he would say a few words in Michael's honor as a distant guest. Joseph, are you on? Bill, do you see if he's on?
I just sent it to Joseph in case he didn't get it.
Ilana, you're muted.
Linda Zisquit on?
I'm here.
Okay, Linda, would you step in?
Yes.
And it's a pleasure to introduce you. Let me just introduce you for a moment. You are our founding poet, and we celebrated a wonderful retirement for you not too long ago, and you're still very much with us all the time, so please.
Thank you, Ilana. I was going to let Alan Hoffman speak for me because he's more eloquent and elegant, but I wanted personally to express my deep, deep appreciation and gratitude to Michael for your generosity, your guidance, your friendship for these many, many years of working together on the creative writing program. You helped me through a lot of challenges and hurdles. You raised my spirits always with your droll humor. And you even supported my own writing and boosted my ego by teaching some of my poems in your Jewish arts seminar. And I think you're wonderful, and I can't believe that you're retiring. And I just wish you all the best. What?
Me neither.
No, anyway, much, much love and thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll ask Professor Alan Hoffman to please address Michael next. Professor Hoffman is also a founding member of the faculty of the Creative Writing Program and a novelist, and we're eager to hear what you have to say to your old friend, Michael.
He's not as old as I thought he would be, but thank you, Ilana. Originally from Brooklyn, Michael arrived at the university as a fresh-faced academic from Sacramento, California. He adjusted quickly to Bar-Ilan, and when asked how things were going, he would answer, "Things could be worse." Michael was already an established member of the English department when Shandy arrived as a young lecturer. As they shared an expertise and interest in American literature, she was drawn to him as a friend and mentor. The department entrusted Shandy with developing a graduate creative writing program. She was spectacular, but things became complex. After the very first meeting on founding the program, held in Michael and Jane's home in Ramot, Shandy flew back to the United States for her first operation. Michael was then the chair of the department and stepped in to help her launch her new program and to assure its successful development. During the course of her illness, Shandy always knew that she could rely upon his support, his guidance, and his stewardship. Wise, loyal, and creative, Michael was there for all of us, for Shandy, for the Rudolph family, for the program's faculty, including our visiting faculty, and above all, for our students. You were heroic, Michael. Ironically, you are retiring at a time dominated by a very different tragic illness that threatens all of us, including Shandy's writing program. I have confidence in the continued success of our program. Although things could be worse, there is also much for which we are very thankful. Ilana and the present program team have had the ennobling and instructive privilege of working with you. As we await better times, we wish you a healthy creative retirement, and of course, we all thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And finally, I'd like to ask Hedda Rudolph, Shandy's mother, Shandy Zichrona Livracha's mother, and benefactor of our program, to give her words for Michael.
Thank you, Ilana. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Good.
Yes,
Good.
we hear you.
Well, I want to, I don't know who's now listening and hearing because of the problem we just had, unfortunately. But I do want to welcome and thank all my friends and family on both sides of the world who are joining us today. But first, a shout out and a thank you to my son-in-law, Ira Olshan, who first suggested that we transfer the planned and canceled conference to Zoom. As soon as I passed along the suggestion to Ilana, she consulted with those involved and quickly came back with a yes, it will happen. So it is bittersweet to be part of the special gathering to honor Michael upon his retirement. I still can't believe it, Michael. However, I am delighted to be together with our renowned guest writers and speakers, Mati Friedman and Yossi Klein Halevi. And I've had the privilege of having read some of their writing and hearing their talks, Mati at a previous Shandy conference, and Yossi in the US. They are here today, especially to give honor to Michael for his many fruitful and dedicated years at Bar Ilan and the Shandy Rudolph program. And Michael has been a faculty member of the English department for whatever, 45 years? I'm not quite sure of the number. Well, you'll know. He has been an integral part of this program from its very inception. Okay, one second. To my mind, Michael is inexorably entwined with Shandy's career at Bar Ilan and specifically with this program. As most of you know, Shandy, my daughter, passed away almost 14 years ago. Her yahrzeit will be in just a couple of weeks on the 14th of Sivan. This program was her brainchild, which together with Michael and Alan, she made into a reality. It was the three of them who created, shaped, and nurtured her vision. Since then, the program has had excellent dedicated directors, from Alan to Marcella and now Ilana. Despite the many challenges, the program continues to thrive, and I hope it will continue even with this latest challenge, despite many challenges, but because of their commitment and fortitude. They have created a space where students from all walks of life and from a range of religious identity are empowered to give voice to their inner world and create literature. The faculty, Michael, Ilana, Marcella, Linda Zisquit, Bill Kolbrener, Alan, and others who have responded with rare sensitivity to their diversity. They have created an environment in which students feel safe and become a community of fledgling writers who respect their difference while encouraging each other. That early foundational work has blossomed into an internationally recognized and respected creative writing program. On a more personal note, I know Michael loved Shandy and she him. He appreciated her specialness, recognized her talent, wit, charm, and gift for communicating with students and with writers. And on her end, she depended on him and received his support, friendship, and wise counsel. I have an indelible memory of Michael coming to visit me in my apartment in New York, not long after Shandy's passing, with a book of compiled letters from her students. They expressed their appreciation for her contribution to their educational experience, their personal growth, and their deep sadness for her loss. That book spoke volumes of the validation of her vision, the new meaning she brought to their lives. I will always remember the two of us sitting in my living room and speaking about Shandy with Michael. Since then, I have attended each conference accompanied by my daughters. I have always looked forward to them and to Michael's delivery of his scholarly, insightful, and literary divrei Torah. His warmth, humility, and plain menschlichkeit have always impressed me. In addition, I've had the pleasure of meeting up with him when he comes to New York, usually for a long and chatty breakfast. I hope that will continue. Michael, I hope you don't step off the stage entirely. You are a huge part of this program. You are very much needed and wanted here. I can't imagine it without you. For all your contribution and dedication, thank you, thank you. A big yasher koach, kol hakavod, and a big hug.
Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me now? Okay. So it looks like we have back about 164 participants, which is really wonderful that people have been able to find their way back. I apologize for the delay and for the interruption. I am going to go straight into the program right now. And if there are those of you who want to wish congratulations and offer your brachot to Michael at the end, I'm sure that he'd be happy to hear them. When Michael and I spoke about this retirement event months ago, I asked him what sort of literary event would most speak to him, and it took him about half a second to answer. He said, I want to get Yossi and Mati in conversation about Israel, and I want to get them in conversation about writing about Israel. Michael said, here are two writers who know how to bring Israel to a global audience and to break out of the expected conversations, the well-rehearsed stories, and they know how to write about Israel with all the complexity that it deserves. I want to say personally that one of the things that's most wonderful about having these two writers with us tonight is that there's an element of surprise to their unfolding careers. And I think that's a wonderful thing to offer Michael on his retirement, because the retirement that Michael is about to engage upon, I'm pretty certain is going to have surprises of its own. Mati and Yossi are both extraordinarily accomplished writers. They're journalists, they're nonfiction writers. As I was going back over their books in the last few days, I was struck by the way that they really are also historians, even though I don't think either one of them would describe themselves as a professional historian. They're doing a new kind of history. And in the best way, we don't know what will come next with them. Their range continues to grow. It opens up new possibilities of style and format. Yossi is most recently the author of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and Mati is most recently the author of Spies of No Country. I'm not going to give them further introductions because many of you know them already, and you can go and find their books, but I want to jump right into discussion. So thank you both for joining us, and thank you also for your patience this evening. Yossi, I'm going to start with you. You began your writing career with an extraordinary book called Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, which shied away from nothing: the weight of the Shoah on a boy growing up in Brooklyn, and the seductive appeal of Jewish power as an answer to the claims of Jewish vulnerability. So you began with Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, and your most recent book is entitled Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. So this presupposes a big jump in the middle, and your books in the middle are that jump, that's certain. But I want to think about the titles of your two works, because I think that they tell us something important about the way you understand your job. Both of them are subjective accounts, memoirs, letters, but the second half of your titles suggests that you see yourself also in a kind of a role, that you're not only an individual, that you occupy a certain moment in history, and that you occupy a certain place in geography. And I want to ask you if you would agree that both your books, as personal as they are, both those kind of bookend books, are also different ways of narrating Israel in real time and thinking about changing visions of Israel's identity. And I wanted to ask if you could tell us whether you think of yourself as a chronicler of Israel, and for whom are you doing that work?
Well, thank you, Lana, and really delighted to be here with you, Mati, and Hedda. Really lovely to meet you, and so many friends online. One of those friends from high school is Michael. Michael and I go back to chapter 5 of Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, which is about high school. I won't recount anything more there, but those of you who know BTA will appreciate why the very mention of those 3 letters can elicit laughter and a sense of uncontrolled mirth. My wife says that I have a laugh that is only reserved for BTA stories. Michael, I'm really touched to be here with you and to close a circle. Thank you. Thank you for this invitation. So the short answer, Ilana, is absolutely. I see myself as a chronicler of Israel. I had the presumption, and in retrospect, I would say the arrogance of seeing myself as a chronicler of Israel as part of my aliyah. That was the job description that was really, in some sense, essential to my aliyah. I was making aliyah in part to chronicle the story. which is to say that I saw myself as a chronicler of a story before I understood the story. And I made Aliyah in the summer of 1982, which was a very humbling time for a would-be chronicler to land in this country, because that was really the moment when the story took an abrupt and unexpected turn. The first time I had visited Israel, I was 14, and it was the summer of 1967, the happy ever after of Jewish history. And the summer of 1982, the beginning of the First Lebanon War, was the anti-Six-Day War. Whatever the Six-Day War was, the Lebanon War was the opposite. The Six-Day War was the opposite of Jewish unity, of the sense of family. And in 1982, we really disintegrated. It was the first and unfortunately only war that we ever fought where we not only couldn't unite, but the war itself was tearing us apart. And so what I realized making Aliyah at that moment was my first responsibility was to listen and learn. And that's what I tried to do. And I spent the next years traveling the country, and rather than chronicling, really trying to absorb. And I'll fast forward to a book that I published in 2011, like Dreamers, which tells the story of a group of paratroopers who fought in '67, and then what happens to Israel through their lives over the next years. And the reason that I wrote that book was because in a sense, I first entered Israel through their experience. Summer of '67 was the summer of the battle. And I wanted to understand what happened to their lives as a way of understanding what happened to Israel. And when I started researching that book, I went to interview one of the main characters, Arik Achmon, who was the intelligence officer of the paratroopers who planned the battle for Jerusalem. And he said to me, "You're never going to be able to do this book because you're a Yeled Chutz. You're an outsider." It's a kibbutz term. It's not a flattering term, Yeled Chutz. And I said to him, "You're right. I am a Yeled Chutz, but what you natives never understood about us was that we were spies among you. And we were always watching you, trying to understand the ways of the natives. And that's why I came to feel that I was able to be a chronicler with an insider's perspective. I mean, it's been almost 40 years, but definitely I came to value the outsiderness that I brought with me as a way of trying to understand the story.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Mati on that pivot really on that point of being a spy, of being somebody who's watching from the outside and in a strange way translating both for the outsiders and the insiders. And Mati, I'd like to ask you a little bit about this too, because you're also somebody who has come to the story of Israel in English, among other things. And I often have the feeling when I'm reading your work that you haven't said it explicitly, but that there's some kind of misperception or there's some kind of perception that you want to either correct or add to about the way people tell the story of Israel. And that your capacity to see it that way does have something to do with coming from the outside. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. I don't want to tire anyone out with more thank yous and brachot, but it is wonderful to be here. And Michael and Yossi have always struck me as two of the country's great mensches, and now I understand that they're both from the same high school, which I had never knew.
They probably didn't have that reputation there.
Be a book. Someone should write a book about whatever the untold chapter from that Brooklyn high school was. I think that I came to Israel when I was 17, and I think I wanted nothing more than to be an insider. I ended up on a kibbutz, a very small religious kibbutz in the north called Ma'ale Gilboa, and I didn't want to be a chronicler of the country. I wanted to be a dairy farmer. I was going to be really on the inside, and It took me a while, and I went into the army, and I did the most Israeli things that I could possibly do. I worked on the kibbutz, and then I was an infantry soldier, and I went to Lebanon, and I came back, and I went to university, and then realized that the outsider's perspective was actually valuable, that I didn't need to ditch the first 17 years of my life or the language with which I was most comfortable, and that actually that could be a valuable tool that would help me see the country with an insider's knowledge, but an outsider's distance. And I've tried to work that in my journalistic career. And one of the first kind of big things that I did was as part of my attempt to grapple with my army service in Lebanon and this very complicated period that Israel experienced in Lebanon in the 1990s, I decided that after the withdrawal in 2000, which is also when I got out of the army, I was going to take my Canadian passport and go back to Lebanon as a Canadian to try to understand the war as an outsider. So I've been in it as an insider, and I was now going to step out of my insider's shoes and come at it from the direction of a naive Canadian who knows nothing about this place. And I kind of wandered around Lebanon like a tourist and tried to see it as an outsider. And that insider-outsider perspective has really been something I've tried to keep in my writing about this place. And something that has surprised me, I always wanted to write about Israel in English. That was always the plan. And I wrote for the Jerusalem Report, which is a great magazine that I like to mention because it's been kind of forgotten. But of course, Yossi was there, one of the great lights of the Jerusalem Report. And I learned a lot at that magazine. And I wanted to write about Israel in English. And I've been surprised to find over the past couple of years that the insider-outsider perspective is not only helpful for outside observers looking at Israel, but it's actually helpful for Israelis. So I wrote something about Lebanon, which is the most Israeli experience that there was for my generation, but it was very different from what other people had done, and Israelis found it valuable because I was an outsider. And there are a few other examples like that, where if you have an outsider's perspective, if you have enough knowledge to really get the country, but the strange perspective of someone who's landed here from the moon, then you can actually shed light on a subject or shed light on the country that hasn't occurred to the native. And that's been one of the surprising benefits, I think, of that perspective to me as a journalist.
Mati, I'm going to jump in and just ask you to talk a little bit more about that. What happens when your work is translated into Hebrew? It's such a funny, it's a funny dynamic in which you're writing material about a history that's happened, and even in your personal history, in Hebrew. You're putting it into English, and then it's being retranslated into Hebrew. And recently, the work that you did on Lebanon has become a TV documentary, and that's being screened by Israelis. It's being screened in Hebrew in Israel. What does that difference in audience do for the story that you're telling? I mean, you began to get at that, but what about the linguistic dimensions?
It's been very weird to experience it. I wrote the book about Lebanon, which is called Pumpkin Flowers in Hebrew. I wrote that book in English. It's a very Israeli story, but it's written in English. And then I had the experience of watching it be translated back into its original language. And I was involved in the translation, but I didn't do the translation. My Hebrew isn't good enough to actually write a book in Hebrew, although I tried and was told to stop trying by my editor, also Yossi's editor. And I am grateful for him saving me many, many months of wasted effort. But I had the experience of seeing this very Israeli story translated back into its native language. And when I read it in Hebrew, it really, I deluded myself into thinking that I wrote it in Hebrew, even though I didn't really. But I think of it as kind of mine in Hebrew. And in some ways, it makes more sense in Hebrew than it does in English. And when Israelis read it, they read it as a native story. And they think it's kind of weird if they notice that it's a translation, which they don't always notice. I have always expected, there have been 3 books so far that I've written in English and have been translated into Hebrew. And each time I expect to have to do major revisions for the Hebrew text, because I tell the editor every time, Israelis know a lot of this stuff, so we don't need to explain it. We can, the book will have to be very different for the Israeli audience. And in all 3 cases, that has not been true. The books have actually been almost untouched in Hebrew because it turns out that Israelis don't actually know all that much about, or not a lot of the things that have to be explained to foreign observers. It's also worthwhile to explain them to Israelis, even though Israelis will never admit that they do not know those things. Of course, they know them already, but you know what, let's just put a page in about what the palmach is, because you'd be surprised what people know and don't know in the the act of stepping back to write a story, which you need to do for someone writing for a foreign audience. You need to step back. You need to say, what were we doing in Lebanon? You need to say, what is the Palmach? You need to say, what is the Bible? You know, just to take examples from my 3 books. But it turns out that for Israelis, you also need to. And when you take that step back, that provides that angle that adds something. And people are I think, grateful for that, that zoom out. If you're writing really from the inside and you think no one needs to have anything explained, and you're kind of writing from the kishkes of the country, you're gonna miss a lot of stuff. And if you step back and say, why were we in Lebanon? Because I need to explain this to Americans. What are we doing in Lebanon? Well, it turns out that's a really good question for Israelis. What were we doing in Lebanon? So the outsider perspective ends up being useful for natives as well, even though they don't like to admit it.
Thank you. I want to turn back to Yossi on this question of language. You two write in English, but your most recent book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, has been translated into Arabic. And I want to ask you what that experience has been like, trying to reach an utterly different audience in a language that often stands as a barrier between Jewish Israelis and Arabs, and what your experience has been talking to people about that book who've encountered it in Arabic.
Yeah, the book really is counterintuitive in a very basic way. It's trying to explain Zionism to well, one might say the victims of Zionism, depending on what your politics are. And I obviously had different audiences in mind for the book. The primary audience remains Palestinians and Arabic readers generally, but I was also very aware of others eavesdropping on this conversation and hoping, of course, that they would. The book has just been translated into Hebrew. It has not yet appeared in Hebrew. That will be a whole other conversation. And Mati, I'm wondering whether Israelis will feel that, you don't tell us what story is. We already know the story. But I suspect that, as you say, that might not be always the case. In terms of Palestinian responses, I put the book out and offered it for free downloading in Arabic. And I rushed through the Arabic translation because I wanted it to come out in Arabic the same day that it came out in English. And I felt that that was really essential for the integrity of the project. Otherwise, it would really seem as if this were intended for the American audience and as an afterthought to the Palestinians. The problem is that the Arabic translation in its first iteration was not good. And I didn't know that until a young Palestinian guy visited me in my office one day. He said to me, I read the Arabic, and then I read the English, and the Arabic is terrible. And then he hands me 5 pages of his own translation. And he said, show this around. And if people tell you that it's good, I'll be happy to do the rest of the translation. And the response was very strong. And so I hired him to do a retranslation. I'm not mentioning his name because he unfortunately had to work anonymously because of fear. He lives in the West Bank and his family doesn't know. In fact, no one knows that he's involved in this project. He wrote a letter in response to the book, and I invited Palestinians to respond to me and write me their narratives. And in the most recent edition, the paperback edition of the book, included a new epilogue of 50 pages of letters from Palestinians to their Israeli neighbor. And what you'll see there is really a range of engagement, appreciation, mild hostility, outright contempt for the Zionist narrative. And I think that that's a pretty good range. I didn't put in the most hateful responses that I got. I got many. I got threats. I got death threats. There's what one would expect those of us who live in this conflict, there are no surprises. But the surprises that did come were these long, thoughtful responses. And I'll tell you one very, very short story about, in a way, my favorite response. A few months ago, I get an 8-page, single-spaced letter from a guy in Ramallah who turns out is a spokesman for the Palestinian Authority. And he writes me, "Congratulations on a very clever work of propaganda. You've managed to pull a fast one over your readers, but I'm on to you." He said, "You and I both know that this entire narrative is false. There is no ancient Jewish presence in this land. It's a Zionist myth. Abraham was a Muslim and not a Jew. The Holocaust could not have possibly happened the way Jews claim it did." And at the end of this long and really depressing letter, he writes to me, "And in conclusion, sir, I would be very happy to get together and continue this fruitful conversation." And I sat with that for a long few weeks and didn't really know what to do. And in the end, I wrote him back and invited him for lunch. We went out to Machane Yehuda, and he brought with him one of Abbas's advisors, and I brought my son with me, and we had lunch. And over the course of lunch, I realized that he hadn't intended only to attack me. He was actually reaching out to me. And between the lines, there was this cry for help. And what he was saying to me, and he said this explicitly over lunch, is, "You know, everything that I've ever heard my entire life about Jews and Israel is the opposite of what you wrote in this book. So help me out here. One of us has gotten the story wrong, and I'd like to know more." And we've since become friends. And now that's an anecdote. It doesn't say anything more, anything larger about this conflict. But I was really looking for a few people on the other side with whom I could model a respectful conversation over irreconcilable differences. And I have found those partners.
You know, I am a fairly recent Ola. It's now almost 6 years since I've come to Israel. And one of the things that has struck me in having left the United States and arrived in Israel, especially having arrived at Bar Ilan, where we have lots of Palestinian students, we have lots of Jewish Israeli students, is the extent to which the stories that I grew up on about Israel simply didn't have Arabs in them. Certainly no one called a Palestinian. And daily life here, especially in the time of Corona, has been dominated, I think, by many Israelis taking a look at the ordinary experiences of the everyday and recognizing how caught up our lives are with each other. And I was thinking a bit about how Mati had written a while ago, I don't remember exactly when this article came out, but you had a wonderful article about industrial talpiyot, which is not far from where we live. And one of the things you said in that article is that when you talk about Jerusalem, most people hear Jerusalem and they think about it symbolically. They think about it in terms of grand historical narratives. And I have the sense at times, Mati, that you're going around Israel finding ways to unearth what's the non-symbolic Jerusalem, or to unearth what's the non-symbolic story and what is really happening on the day-to-day. And one of the points you make in that article is that people's lives are more and more enmeshed. And when I read that, I think that that's news really for a readership that doesn't live here. That's news. Maybe it's also news for a readership that does live here, but it's news for a readership that I think of as predominantly American, because those are the stories that Jewish Americans still are not getting raised on. Kids aren't getting raised on those stories. And Jewish communities in the United States tend not to hear much about. And I thought of the poem by Amichai where he talks about the tourists who come and they look at the arches and they look at everything. And somebody in that poem says, you know, the moment that they're going to look at the fruit seller who's sitting underneath the arch and who's bringing home food for their family, that's the real. That's when the Messiah comes. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the way in which you're also revising a pretty ideologically limited version of experience in Israel for an audience outside.
Thank you for noticing that article. I can't remember when I wrote it.
I wander through industrial talpiot all the time too, and so it's a stomping grounds.
Yeah, it's pretty typical, I think, for a lot of writers to wander through, you know, to be in talpiot, but never to write about it, because that's not what's important. And people who look at the city are going to look at the Temple Mount, and they're going to look at Damascus Gate, and they're going to look at the old city, and that's what's important. But what's going on at Kenyon Malcha, at the Malcha Amal, that's not important. Who cares about that? But most of the people in the city live in the Malcha Mall and never go anywhere near the Temple Mount. So I've tried to kind of bring that to the fore and talk about the city, which is no, you know, island of peace and love and brotherhood, but is actually a remarkably functional and non-violent place. And just to give you an example, Jerusalem has about 900,000 people. If you take every violent death in the city last year for any reason, political, terrorism, domestic homicide, criminal homicide, the number, as far as I can tell, is 7. The police won't give you the number, but as I kind of put it together at the end of every year, there were 7 violent deaths for any reason in the city of Jerusalem last year. In Indianapolis, which is a city the same size as Jerusalem, the number was 179, and that's pretty standard for an American city that size. So this is a city that in many ways is, you know, divided and fractious, and in many ways is remarkably safe and functional when it really has no right to be. There are, you know, such different kinds of people living in the city, and they seem not to like each other, and they have very different stories. But when you live here for long enough, you realize that there's the story level of the city, and then there's the actual life level of the city. So if you go to, you know, a garage in Talpiot and you talk, you know, to the guy who runs the garage, he's probably going to be a very right-wing Jewish guy who thinks that, you know, Muslims have no right to the land. And if you speak to the guys working in the garage, they might be Hamas supporters. A lot of people from East Jerusalem are Hamas supporters who think, like Yossi said, that, you know, the temple in Jerusalem is a fiction that the Zionists invented and that the Holocaust never happened. That's on the story level. And then you say, okay, that's what you believe, but what do you do in the morning? And they say, oh, in the morning I wake up and I go to work in Talpiot with Yossi, or, you know, but that's not important. That's not, you know, that's not ideology. That's just life. But the life of the place ends up shaping it most of the time. So I've tried to pay attention to that without trying to say, which some people like to say, without trying to say, look how great it is, it's fine, you know, this is wonderful. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that the place doesn't work the way people think it works. And if you portray people constantly in their ideological uniform, which is the way people like to be portrayed, when you interview people as a journalist, they're going to give you their ideological story. And that's one way of looking at it. And most journalists stop there because that's the story they know and that's what everyone knows. But if you go beyond the ideological story, okay, you support Hamas and you believe that Jews have no right to be here. Okay, where do you work? What Kupat Cholim do you belong to? And then you have a different conversation, which really is a window into the life of the city and into the life of the country in general, which I think doesn't really correspond to the very simplified kind of symbolic narratives that have been stuck on the country. Israel has very little to do with the story of Israel, as most outside observers know it. And the problem that you run into as a journalist when you're trying to tell the stories of the industrial zone in Talpiot, or obscure stories about things no one cares about, is that that's not what a lot of people are looking for. A lot of people want a symbolic story, and they want Israel to be the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world, or they want it to be, you know, a story about Jewish redemption after the Holocaust. Not everyone's looking for daily life, but I've decided that that's what I'll try to shine a spotlight on when I can.
Thank you. I want to think about that daily life issue in a different vein. We've mentioned already tonight that Michael is an extraordinarily big fan of Dylan. So I want to turn to music for a second, because I also think that this is something that draws Mati and Yossi together. You're both big listeners to Israeli music. And as if I had to try to, you know, guess what might come next, I feel like you probably both want to write about music at some point, Yossi, especially you. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that's another narrative of Israel?
It's really interesting listening to you, Mati. I'm such a fan of your work, and you've really helped me clarify what it is that I don't do, and I don't do that. What I'm really interested in is the mythic side of Israel. And I think that has to do with coming of age in 1967 and 1973 and having that so deeply imprinted on my being, and really being so conscious of having been born at and this goes back to your first question, Ilana, having been born at a very precise moment of Jewish history. And that's the moment that can be defined in one word. The word is after. After the fulfillment of the great Jewish nightmares and dreams. And it all happened just before Michael and I were born. And that shaped our generation more than anything else, the word after. And that is the Israel that I'm still looking for, even though I love your Israel. I love the quote ordinary Israel, which is not ordinary at all. I think it's an extraordinarily abnormal, normal country, and really the notion of normalizing the Jews in the Middle East on a strip of land holy to three competing religions. Only the Jewish mind could have come up with that idea. And but good luck to you, Mati, in looking for the normal Israel. But it's interesting because to answer your question, Ilana, and I'd be very interested to know how you answer this, Mati, but Israeli music is that precise point of encounter between mythic Israel and normal Israel. Mm-hmm. And you see those two themes moving in and out of the same artist's work. Ehud Banai, for example, I think is a classic example of someone who loves normal, ordinary Israel. And at the same time, much of his music is about redemption. And there's no contradiction there. And sometimes you'll see it in the same song. You'll see his terrific irony. He has this great song called Yom Ha'atzmaut from his latest album, which is magnificent. And you really see this song celebrating the mythic Israel and the painfully ordinary Israel at the same time. And so what I cherish about Israeli music is, well, first of all, very personally, that was my language. That's how I became an Israeli. I owned Israeli music, and that's available for any immigrant. It's available for any diaspora Jew. And one of the missions that I have, I would say, I've sensed this in your writing as well, Mati, is trying to get diaspora Jews to own Israeli music, because the music that we're creating here, I feel, is not just Israeli. I really feel this belongs to the Jewish people.
And maybe I can jump in there and just ask Mati to respond too, because, Mati, one of the things that characterizes your work is the conviction that Israel is part of the Middle East, and that is somehow sometimes effaced in thinking about Israel. And in your most recent book, Spies of No Country, that seems to be really the groundwork from which it all begins. And is that part of what the appeal of Israeli music is for you, the sense of Middle Eastern that it incorporates too?
I just want to throw in a recommendation here. If anyone who hasn't heard Yossi's podcast interview with Mosaic Magazine from about a month ago about Israeli music, it's phenomenal. It's a really incredible introduction to some great songs, including some Banai, and how you can use that music to see into the soul of the country, which I totally believe. I've also written about Israeli music over the past couple of years, but I've concentrated more on trashy pop music, just because my kids started bringing it home a few years ago, and I was trying to figure out what on earth was going on in the Israeli pop scene. And I've tried to write about, what is now mainstream Israeli pop, which is called Mizrahi, or Eastern or Middle Eastern. The main pop genre these days is this kind of Middle Eastern blend of it's Hebrew, but it's the Middle Eastern and it's Greek and it's got some Western in it, and it's hard on the Western ear. So if you're a Western ole, it kind of grates, and you really have to train yourself to be able to hear it. And I still don't love most of it, but it's very, very interesting. It's very interesting music, and it says a lot about the country. And I've tried to access that Middle Eastern soul through the music, kind of using the Yossi method, which is take the songs and see where they take you and see how that can be used as a tool to see the country. And I just wrote an article for the Times a month or two ago or three about one of Israel's biggest pop stars of the moment, who Nasreen. She's known as Nasreen. Her name's Nasreen Kadri, and she's born an Arab Muslim from Haifa, became a mega star in the Mizrahi scene. She sings in Hebrew, she sings in Arabic, but she's a Middle Eastern diva on the Middle Eastern diva model, and she has converted to Judaism, embraced Judaism. She's a completely Israeli creature. It could only exist in the state of Israel in 2020, and if you go to one of her concerts, it's just a mind-blowing experience, because it makes absolutely no sense if you come to Israel with ideas about the kibbutz and Ben Gurion and the Hora and the pioneers. I mean, it's nowhere. It's something completely different. It's something quite amazing, and we have to kind of grapple. I think it's hard for Western Odim particularly. We have to grapple with the fact that this country is in the Middle East, and it's not just in the Middle East. It's not just a bunch of European Jews who are dumped into the Middle East. The country is largely Middle Eastern in its makeup. At least half of the Jewish population of Israel has roots in the Islamic world and had very little to do with Herzl and Ben Gurion and the Holocaust and the kibbutz, and has a different story that we've been slow to understand. That's really shaped the country. It shapes the music, but it also shapes our politics, and it shapes the way Israelis see religion, which is very different from the way Western Jews see religion. And it shapes the supermarket aisles, the food you can find in the supermarkets, and it shapes the way people behave. And you need to kind of wrap your head around that if you're going to understand Israel. We have to get away from the European stories, which we still really like. This country has very little to do with Warsaw now. It has a lot to do with Kurdistan. It has a lot to do with Aleppo. And that's a big leap for Western observers. And I've tried to do that in my writing as a way of helping people trying to grasp this country from afar, help them make that jump to the Middle East and understand this culture and society, which has been this new, dynamic, miraculous kind of culture and society that is an incredible success story and is richer, I think, beyond what anyone could have imagined at the beginning, but is very different from what they imagined at the beginning, because it is not Western, and it's much more like Alexandria or Beirut than it is like Vienna or Paris, which is not what they were planning, but it's something amazing. And you hear Ehud Banai, or when you hear, Nasreen, when you hear this stuff, this is not what Herzl had in mind, but it could only have been created in the Jewish state. The culture is alive and kicking. There's nothing artificial about it. It's not done for a foreign audience. It's from here. The place has its own cultural engine, and in many ways, it's never been healthier.
Yeah, that's why lots of us are here, I think. Yossi, I want to go back. We're coming to the end of our evening here, but I really want to go back to the mythic, because it's true that it's fascinating. You and Mati, in some ways, do something similar, which is you write really, really well. You write in some ways like novelists. You write in some ways like memoirists. You tell stories that are from the inside out. And at the same time, it's true that Mati is doing something on the level of the real and the everyday. And Yossi, I mean, you wrote a book called Like Dreamers, Hayinu Kecholmim. Obviously, you're interested in the dreams. And you talk in that book about how the utopian dreams came apart and consensus split. And I wondered if, in the years, even the few years since you wrote that book, do you feel like there are any big dreams in Israel anymore?
Not yet.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the reasons this is such a painful period, and Mati, you may dispute this, but I feel this is a time of deep confusion, existential confusion, is because we are bereft of a utopian dream. Utopian dreams founded this country, empowered the country. A book like Dreamers really tells the story of how religious Zionism and the settlement movement took over the utopian dream. I personally am not in that camp, but I appreciate the vitality that messianic dreams have really given this country. And now the settlement movement doesn't have a messianic impetus anymore, which is probably good politically. I think that we in some sense, we're orphaned, and there are no big dreams yet. But I really emphasize yet because I believe that that there is no state of Israel without an extravagant dream, and I believe that that's coming. And I've always been a closet messianist. I've always believed that we live in a time that could be a time of redemption, that is in fact some kind of redemption. But it's not surprising to me that we have movements in our generation that declare this the messianic time. I resonate with that, even if I don't resonate with the expressions that those movements take. And so I'm waiting for that next dream, and that's the Israel that I'm waiting to write about next.
Mm-hmm. Mati, can you tell us anything about what you're working on these days? Are you working on a new project or anything that would help us understand where you see the future of inquiry about Israel right now, at least for you?
I've been busy over the past little while with this Lebanon documentary, which was my first experience ever with television, and it's Israeli television. It was a real learning experience, and I've been my head has been buried deep in Lebanon again, which has been strange. Israel spent 18 years trying to get out of Lebanon. That happened in 2000, and I've been stuck in Lebanon more or less since then, and I'm trying to get out. I have a project that I've been working on for a while that I've actually discussed with Yossi at length, that I won't get too detailed about it, but it's about the Yom Kippur War, and it has a musical angle. It's about an interesting moment. But what I've tried to do in this most recent published book, Spies of No Country, and other things I've been writing about, is to try to encourage people to think Middle Eastern and pay more attention to the half of Jewish Israelis who came here from the Islamic world, and whose children and grandchildren have shaped the country and shaped the culture of the country. And that's been the main emphasis of my work, and also an attempt to get at the kind of everyday culture of the country, the pop concerts, the industrial zones, the supermarket, and kind of to try to appreciate that fabric of life that has made this a great place to live, while at the same time it is, as Yossi said, bereft of dreams. We're bereft of leadership. We're bereft of dreams. People don't know where the place is going. We don't have that fuel that made the country tick for decades. It's gone. I mean, it's unbelievable how gone it is. I think it still existed to some extent. When I moved to Israel in 1995, there was the dream of peace. That was very much kind of an aftershock of those utopian dreams of the founders. That was the last thing that was supposed to happen. We achieved the country, we achieved security, and then we're going to achieve peace. And in the year 2000, the year we pull out of Lebanon, and the year the peace talks fell apart, it all disappears, and the country, loses that thing that was so great about it. The kibbutz movement dies, the left dies, the utopian dreams die, and we've had this very strange 20 years bereft of those dreams, while at the same time the country has become a better place than it has ever been at any time, economically, culturally. We're safer in the past decade than we've ever been in the history of the country. So there's this weird dissonance going on, and I've tried to, acknowledge the lack of dreams and what that means. I've also tried to access the vitality of everyday life. That is what keeps the place going right now, in the absence of those dreams, which I think is underappreciated. The country is very much alive, more alive, I think, than people probably had a right to expect 50 or 60 years ago.
Thank you. I'm thinking that, in Corona time, which we are still somewhat in, at least many of you in the United States are certainly in, there's a strange way in which we live nowhere and we live somewhere. And the somewhere where we live is the place we miss, the streets we miss being out on, the people we miss seeing on the day-to-day. And there's a kind of illusion or fantasy that it doesn't matter where you live because everything is virtual. But I think that, there's some way in which what both of you are describing is the centrality of the local, that we really are where we are. And yet how important it is to be able to translate it into language that will travel. And I think that this is really a very, very appropriate kind of testimony to the work that Michael has done in helping students, generations of students, understand more about where they come from, understand about where others come from, bringing the distant local and the reverse, and doing all that work of articulation. That is something that has really characterized Michael's career, characterizes the work that Mati and Yossi both do for multiple audiences. So I really, really want to thank you both for fulfilling Michael's dream of having you together, in the same virtual room at least, for this conversation. It seems like just a perfect way to honor him. And I do want to also give a chance for Joseph Skybell to say just a few words to Michael, if he would like to at the evening's close, now that I hope he's back with us from Atlanta, and for anybody else who also say goodnight and thank you to Michael. So thank you, Mati and Yossi, very, very much for joining.
How long are you staying?
Sorry? Okay, so could we just get Joseph back on if he's here? Because I know he was hoping. Is he there? Okay.
Thank Michael. While Joseph gets his act together over in Atlanta, good luck with everything, Michael. It's been, you're not going anywhere, but
certainly isn't. He's still on speed dial. Don't worry.
That's also a Dylan song, right? You ain't going nowhere.
Is Joseph here?
Is Joseph with us? Let's. Just looking to see. I'm not seeing. Is he here? Okay, I'm having trouble locating him if he is here. Okay, so it may be that he wasn't able to rejoin us from Atlanta. Okay, in any event then, I'm gonna close the program tonight. Michael, do you wanna say goodbye to all your admirers and friends?
A little bit speechless. It's very clear to me that
Sorry, Michael, sorry.
writers, and I didn't recognize the person you were talking about, but okay. I knew that Yossi and Mati and you together were going to be terrific, and I just thank you all. It's even with all the hacking, it was something, and it was quite memorable. And I suppose if I have to say goodbye in some way, this is a way to do it, but I really don't want to.
Well, we're not letting you. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us tonight. And we hope we'll see you at other events and other simchas. So have a good evening and afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Mazel tov, Michael.
Mazel tov.
Bye.